weaving a web of meaning. And in particular, how recognizing our deep interrelatedness lays the path to sustainable flourishing. Complexity science, systems biology, chaos theory. What they describe is a world in which everything is connected, and very crucially, in non-linear ways. When I look at that picture, I know that was me. I might even have the memories to prove it. But here's what's fascinating. There's not a single molecule in that little kid, most likely, that is in me right now. As I'm going to explore in this presentation with you, every one of those elements of that story is actually false.
I want to emphasize to begin with that there is a somewhat superficial view of the meaning of wholeness or holistic practice. It's a view that complexity thinker Edgar Morin described as everything thrown together in a plastic bag. And this is not what the Wholeness Project is about. There is a much deeper view of holistic perspective and practice. And this emerged through the person that coined the term, Jan Smuts, as a synthesis of these Judeo-Christian ethos, the most up-to-date science at the time, and a deep transcendental experience in the African felt. He was informed by a much deeper sense of connectedness with all. And it is that we're examining, the depth and profundity of that seminal work. And especially how recent concepts have enriched that with various creative thinkers and practitioners in what seems to us to be a reawakening to the holistic perspective and practice, a regaining of what was lost. And so within that, the special focus is on human becoming. Who are we becoming as an evolutionary human species in this deeper perspective and the enrichment and development of that inner world? So just when we look to the future, we're looking to two major events. The one is in 2026, which will be the 100th anniversary of the publication of Holism and Evolution. And there we'll celebrate with those who have tried to do something about it, to put it into practice in their various fields. We'll celebrate their learnings, their endeavors. The next major event, and by the way, I'll be turning 80 then. The next major event will be in 2031, which will be the 100th anniversary of Smuts' address to the British Association for the Advancement of Science, where he introduced the holistic worldview to that scientific body. And there we will review the progress from reductionism to holism in our scientific and philosophical worldview. And we're already collaborating with a number of institutions beginning to explore collaboration around this very topic. So our presentations and our workshop are ended exploring how transformed practice will not only help us address our existential challenges, but how that might convert them into our opportunity for further growth as people. And we'll shortly announce details of a 5-month training program, Cultivating Holistic Perspective and Practice. And that is why we are so excited to welcome Jeremy Lent's presentation tonight. So excited. And the theme, Jeremy, that you're going to be offering us is weaving a web of meaning, how recognizing our deep interrelatedness lays the path to sustainable flourishing.
My grandfather was a flat earther. He was a deeply religious man, and he couldn't conceive of a different worldview from the literal interpretation that he'd internalized as part of who he was. But despite what we would now see as primitive and a fundamentalist interpretation of reality, he was also one of the kindest, most generous people you could ever wish to meet, and took his duty to the values of respect, responsibility, and reciprocity with others and with all life extremely seriously. And it seems today that we've somehow come full circle, because we're in a way not in a dissimilar position, that we have internalized a mainstream materialist worldview and somehow can't see beyond it. So we have the strange contradiction now of scientists trying to present the science of Gaia to scientists in a way that avoids them having to engage with teleology. But I think that Jeremy's work, for me, offers a multidimensional view of human knowledge, culture, science, philosophy, and religion that can guide us towards a new integration and a new universal story, which hopefully can create a culture of harmony that allows us to live in harmony with all life. And I think this is the importance of Jeremy's amazing overview of human knowledge and cultures. So I just hand over to you, Jeremy.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction to these themes, Joshua. That's great. And yeah, I'm just excited to be here to share my ideas and perspectives with you all today. So this is what I'm going to be talking about today, weaving a web of meaning. And yeah, in particular, how recognizing our deep interrelatedness lays the path to sustainable flourishing. And well, to begin with, yeah, I love the name of your organization, Holos, and the Holos Earth Project. And so what better way to begin a presentation like this, but with a picture of the whole Earth, like, you know, almost like the original one that started the whole Earth catalog some decades ago. So we are contemplating the Earth, our only home, and the only place we know of right now that actually has life on it anywhere in the universe, even though there might be other places that we're not aware of. And here on this beautiful little planet, billions of years ago, life began and evolved into this incredible abundance. And then just a couple 100,000 years ago, a particular species developed the ability to have power over the rest of all other sentient beings of life on Earth. And as we know, we've come to this place where we have become basically a force of nature. And so we can ask ourselves, you know, at this point, like, well, how have we been doing in this incredible power that we've had over the rest of life on Earth? And the terrible answer is we've been doing awfully. As we know right now, we're looking at these harbingers of the daunting future from climate breakdown, with wildfires all around the world and floods and droughts, just giving us a sense of not just a one-off thing, but just a taste for how much worse it's going to get. And probably everyone in this group is familiar with something like this kind of chart, that we're facing a true climate emergency, that at the current rates, it's most likely by the end of this century that we're going to be hitting what scientists call a catastrophic global temperature increase of 3 degrees or more. And even if we were able to meet these pledges and targets that governments have been talking about at these various COPs, 2%, which is getting to be more and more of an ambitious target, scientists call a prescription for disaster. Even the 1.5%, which is at the moment almost like this kind of Hail Mary, is not considered even a safe target. But here's the thing. Even if we were to somehow find some magic bullet that could actually bring our climate emergency out of this terrible sphere into something that was manageable, we got to recognize that climate emergency itself is really just a symptom of a deeper underlying problem, which is that as our civilization is causing vast ecological destruction across the board. And just to give you a few basic pointers of that, there's been a 68% decline in animal populations just since 1970. All animal populations worldwide. As a result of that and other factors, we're now looking at the 6th great extinction of species since life began on this earth billions of years ago. Only this would be the first one that's caused by one particular species sort of running amok. Even if things went well, scientists are now forecasting that we're going to be looking at the virtual annihilation of coral reefs worldwide this century. And the United Nations forecasts that by the middle of the century, 95% of Earth's land will be degraded. And with all these statistics, the one that blows me away more than anything is this one. By 2050, at current rates, there will be more plastic in the ocean by weight than fish. Just mind-blowing. Now, many of us are kind of either vaguely or specifically aware that all of this destruction is the result of what's been called the Great Acceleration. Since the end of the Second World War, the great acceleration of the production and consumption of stuff that humans have been doing around the world. This chart just gives you a sense, like scientists study this, and you can see when they put these charts together, why they call this the Great Acceleration. Almost every single aspect of human activity related to production and consumption, it's gone kind of wild. So this is the situation we're in now. But what's even more terrifying is that at current rates, global production is projected to triple by 2060. So with all of this going on right now, it's hard to even conceive of a tripling of this rate of production and consumption over the next few decades, which is why, and as Joshua was talking about a little bit, we're rapidly heading for a precipice that scientists are giving like dire warnings to the rest of the world about. Johan Rockström and a team in Stockholm developed a few years ago this model looking at planetary boundaries, the safe operating space through which humanity could hope to have a flourishing future. We've already broken through 5 of those planetary boundaries. And as a result of that, we get these warnings from scientists to the rest of humanity. There's a paper put out called The World Scientists Warning to Humanity. It was actually a second notice talking about how soon it will be too late to shift course away from our failing trajectory. Leading professor Hans Schellenhuber talks about a very big risk we will end our civilization. And the ex-UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon told global leaders just a few years back, this is a global suicide pact. So it's reasonable to ask when we're looking at that, how did we get into this mess? What did we do to get into this place? And I actually studied this over a number of years. And in a book that I published a few years back, I looked at the kind of historical underlayings to how we got to this place. It's called the patterning instinct. It's a cultural history of humanity's search for meaning. And I'm not going to go into detail in that historical layering in this presentation, but one thing that arose, one clear essence that arose from that study that I did is this learning that culture shapes values, and those values shape history. And by the same token, our values will shape the future. So let's turn to look at our values, meaning the values of the dominant worldview that all of us are embedded in right now. What are those values? Well, those values are basically values based on separation. I view this picture as kind of iconic of that. Is everyone standing in line, but separate from each other, even separate from the food they're eating, not even thinking about where it's coming from, but totally connected with a technology that's manipulating their minds to make more money for these big mega companies. And underlying all of our interactions in our modern society is this modern story of separation. Or implicit, almost every idea, everything that's talked about is this story that nature is a machine, that humans are separate from nature, that humans are separate from each other, that human progress arises from the conquest of nature, that the earth is a resource to exploit for human benefit. And as a result of all this, the purpose of life is basically to get wealthy and powerful as much as you can. But in my more recent book, The Web of Meaning, that just came out last year, and as I'm going to explore in this presentation with you, it shows that every one of those elements of that story of separation is actually false. And we're going to take a look at that by focusing mostly on the subtitle of this book, Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe. And in the book, and in the rest of this presentation, we're going to look exactly at that. We're going to see how the findings of modern sciences in neuroscience, complexity science, evolutionary biology, or system sciences point to the same underlying insights as traditional wisdom, such as indigenous knowledge and Taoism and Buddhism, the insights of our intrinsic interconnectedness. And that's what we're going to be exploring. And we're going to kind of delve into it more by focusing attention one by one on some of the biggest existential questions that humans ask, that probably pretty much every human asks in some form or other at some point in their life. Questions like, who am I? Where am I? What am I? How should I live? And why am I? And so let's go into this, and let's begin with that first question. Who am I? And probably if you ask pretty anyone on the street some sort of question about their identity in our modern worldview, it's most likely that their answer will stem ultimately from this statement by Descartes a few hundred years ago, probably the most famous statement in philosophy. I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum in Latin. And if you think about what that's actually saying, basically is saying that our human identity exists solely through our conceptualizing faculty. And the implication of that is that therefore animals who don't think like human beings, and even our own bodies that aren't thinking in the way that Descartes meant, don't really have an existence. And they're kind of basically just like mere machines. But in recent decades, ethologists studying animals tell us that animals are most definitely not machines. Elephants communicate with each other over hundreds of miles through infrasound. They perform ceremonies over dead family members. People studying dolphins and whales now recognize that they talk to each other, like they've even identified local dialects. They call each other by name, and they think they even gossip about those who are temporarily absent. Wolves, for example, display deep family commitment, and males help raise their young until they reach maturity. But, you know, it's easy enough to at least get some sense that these amazing high-functioning mammals are obviously not machines. But now people studying plants have shown definitively that plants themselves have a networked intelligence. It's like a distributed intelligence. Plants have up to 20 different senses with which they interact with the environment. They act intentionally and purposefully. They have been shown to learn and have memories, and they communicate with each other. Biologist Suzanne Simard coined the term the wood wide web to describe what she's found of how trees use their root network to connect with a mycorrhizal fungal network underground to share information with each other. And they even use that network to allocate resources as a community. And then what's perhaps even more kind of mind-blowing is cellular biologists who have now gotten to study living cells now report that even single cells display stunning intelligence, like awe-inspiring way in which they act. So a single cell, and we have 40 trillion of these cells within each of our bodies, roughly. Every one of these cells has thousands of sensors and proteins. They send and receive hundreds of signals at a time. A cell is aware of itself and others. It knows what to do. Cells will cooperate in communities, and they've even been shown to make decisions as a group. So now modern science is really just beginning to understand this incredible intelligence within nature and sort of beginning to shake some of the foundations of that modern worldview with it. But if we look at other worldviews throughout history, such as indigenous worldviews, we find that that knowledge, that sense of the deep intelligence within nature was something that was understood. And in particular, let's turn our attention to the ideas from ancient Taoism in China. More than a couple of thousand years ago, it led to the writing of this great classic that most people have heard of or maybe know, the Tao Te Ching, which translates as the classic of Tao and De. Now, most people know what the word Tao means or has some sense of it. It basically translates as something like the way or path, the way in which the forces of nature manifest in the world. People are less familiar, though, with the word De, which is part of the title, Classic of Tao and De. And De refers to like the spontaneity, the intrinsic nature that is inherent in all living things. And the ancient Taoists looked at nature and they saw that all of the natural world acted with De. And they called that acting with what they called wu wei, or effortless action. And as they looked at everything in nature, animals, birds, plants, they saw these non-human organisms acting naturally in wu wei, which led to this kind of key question: well, what happened to humans then? Because rather than acting with effortless action, they saw humans acting with what they called yu wei, or purposive action. And they would describe those things like using fire to dry up a well, or like forcing water uphill to irrigate a mountainside. And you might say, well, isn't that kind of what civilization is all about, is acting in that kind of yu wei? And the Taoists would have responded, exactly. And from that, they developed essentially like a theory of civilization. In the words of Zhuangzi, one of their great sages, he talked about how in original times, the men of old shared the placid tranquility which belonged to the whole world, like in a state of perfect unity. People lived on terms of equality with all creatures, like forming one family. And then with that yu wei way of thinking in their minds, people began to everywhere to become suspicious with extravagant orchestras and ceremonies. Men began to be separated from one another. Now, what's fascinating is that in recent decades, modern cognitive neuroscience has validated basically that Taoist theory of civilization. And they've come to recognize that the prefrontal cortex, which is uniquely advanced in humans compared to other mammals, is what mediates that yu wei cognition that the Taoists identified. It's what's responsible for these uniquely advanced in humans faculties like symbolic thought, conceptualizing, planning, and creating abstractions. And cognitive anthropologists, when they look at how humans first evolved as humans, and they saw that emergence of symbolic thought as being ultimately the causation for things like language, culture, arts, and tool making. So what modern cognitive scientists have now come to recognize is that we basically have a dual human consciousness. We have that conceptual consciousness that Descartes thought was the only source of identity, which is analytic, slow, rational, effortful, and which corresponds to that Taoist notion of yu wei. But we also have an animate consciousness, along with the rest of all of life. And in humans, that animate consciousness is what is intuitive, fast, emotional, effortless, corresponding to that Taoist notion of wu wei, which leads us to recognize that rather than just being these cogito ergo sum, thinking beings, really we have both layers of consciousness, and our challenge as human beings is to integrate both systems in harmony. So now when we look at this question, who am I? We can begin to answer it with this kind of notion of, well, I am a mind-body organism that's capable of integration. So let's move on to that next question. Where am I? And if we ask, again, somebody from anywhere in the mainstream, a dominant worldview around the world, they'll probably give you an answer that corresponds to some notion of a split universe, a sense that there's some sort of transcendent God or some sort of spiritual realm separate from the material world. And there's this kind of generally shared recognition that religion and science exist in different domains. There's one domain that's appropriate for religion, one that's appropriate for science, but they don't really meet. And that kind of sense of a split worldview is one of the things that has led to our unsustainable way of living, where it's considered okay to like pray to that source of transcendent meaning, even while we ransack nature below. But that sense of a split universe is not actually one that's shared by other cultures and other ways of thinking around the world. And if we turn once again to China, and this time to China from about 1,000 years ago during the Song Dynasty, what's a fascinating way of making a sense of the universe there was developed by a group of thinkers. They call themselves the School of the Tao. And around then, about 1,000 years ago, this group actually integrated the three great traditions that had developed of thought in China over the millennia or more previous to that. Taoism was one, Confucianism was another, and the third was Buddhism, which had originated in India, but by then had become a core part of Chinese ways of thinking at that time. And this group call themselves the School of the Tao, but we know them nowadays by the term Neo-Confucianism. And for the Neo-Confucians, they ended up creating a synthesis of each of these traditions to form a very comprehensive, systematic way of understanding the universe that was not like that sense of separateness that we saw before. And for the Neo-Confucians, the entire universe consisted of qi, which we can translate roughly as matter and or energy, the sort of stuff of the universe. But to them, equally or even more important was this notion of li, which they really saw as the principles by which the qi all connected up with each other to form the way the universe is manifested. And when they looked at the li, these principles of connection, they sensed that the totality of all the li in the universe, these self-organized principles of the universe, that's what they understood as being the Tao. Now, again, if we fast forward to modern times, what we find is that modern system sciences also point to a connected universe, just like very similar to the one that they were describing, whether it's complexity science, systems biology, or chaos theory. What they show and what they describe is a world in which everything is connected, and very crucially, in non-linear ways. So, like in the famous question by Edward Lorenz, the founder of chaos theory some decades back, he asked, is it possible that the flaps of a butterfly's wings in Brazil could lead to a tornado in Texas because of the ways in which all these complex nonlinear interactions happen? And what's crucial from these sciences is that they've begun to recognize that oftentimes the interactions between things tell us more about them than the things themselves, whether it's starlings flocking in the sky, or schools of fish in the ocean, or the ripples of sand in the desert, or the whole weather system on Earth, or even the structure of galaxies. Oftentimes it's the interactions that are most important. Now, that's kind of a hard thing for us to get our heads around and steeped in our dominant worldview. So one way to get a feeling for this is I'm going to ask you to pause for a moment and just think of a photograph of yourself when you were a little child. So think of that. So you got that in your mind. Here's one of me when I was a little kid. Now, when I look at that picture, I know that was me. I might even have the memories to prove it. But here's what's fascinating. There's not a single molecule in that little kid, most likely, that is in me right now. Almost all of the cells in that little boy are different from the ones in me now. And there's a few cells in the human body that remain in us throughout our lives, but even those cells are continually reformulating what they're made of, which is why I can say that probably not a single molecule in that kid that's in me now, and yet I know that was me. So what connects me with that little boy? Not the stuff, but the ways in which those different molecules and different particles interacted with each other, the relationships they formed with each other, are what actually remain resilient, which allows me to retain my memories and to be who I am as a result of that little boy's experiences. So that's why it's so critical to understand these patterns in nature. And when scientists have tried to look at understanding some of these core principles of these patterns in nature, one of the crucial elements they've discovered is what they call fractals. Now, many of you will be familiar with this notion of fractals. They're patterns that repeat themselves at different scales. They indicate self-organized activity. And we see them virtually everywhere in the natural world. We see them in coastlines, in patterning on leaves, in lightning, the structures of our lungs, and in the ways in which our neurons self-organize. And scientists have begun to recognize now, when they look at nature, that nature itself is a fractally connected system, where every cell is organized by similar principles to the organism which it's part, which is also fractally connected then with its own species, which is fractally connected with the same principles of the ecosystem of which the species is part. And ultimately, all these ecosystems are a fractal part of the living earth, of Gaia. So now when we turn to this question, where am I? We can begin to look at a different kind of answer. We can say, well, I'm part of a fractally connected, self-organized universe. So with that basis, let's turn to this next question, what am I? And one way to begin looking at this question is to start with the wisdom of one of those great Confucian sages from 1,000 years ago, who made this great statement. He said, if one wishes to know the reality of Tao, one must seek it in one's own nature. But again, if we turn to our modern worldview and ask for what is our own nature, we're likely to get an answer that will be based somewhat on this notion that was popularized some decades ago by Richard Dawkins, and that we're all basically the function of selfish genes. In his words, that got to be so popularly accepted around the world, we and all other animals are machines created by our genes in a highly competitive world. And so, as he says, a predominant quality to be expected in a successful gene is ruthless selfishness. And so for people who probe that one level deeper, what they find, according to Dawkins, is that the gene is the fundamental unit of evolution. It dictates everything about the organism. It's inherently selfish and competitive. Thinking people around the world take this as granted. This is the scientific truth. But modern findings in biology have shown that every one of those statements about the gene are actually false. It turns out that, in fact, genes are part of an iterative process with the cell. They don't dictate everything about the cell. They're actually part of a vibrant, dynamic, circular flow of interactivity. And biologists now tell us that we can think of the genotype more like an artist's palette, like a repertoire of capabilities that the cell can select based on its particular needs as determined by the environment. And to get a sense of how powerful that is to understand, here's an example that I think is so just incredible to consider. Consider for a moment the grasshopper, gentle, solitary creature, like munching away on a little leaf, so sweet, right? Well, it turns out that grasshopper has exactly the same DNA as a swarm of locusts that can devour, like aggressive swarms that can devour millions of acres of land over just a few hours. It's exactly the same DNA. At certain points, certain grasshoppers, their organism switches the expression of that DNA and actually changes their form, changes their behavior, and they become part of the swarm of locusts. And then at a certain point, the organism decides it's time to turn back to a sweet little grasshopper again. Same DNA, different organisms. So that kind of recognizes that the gene itself is not necessarily the sole fundamental driver of evolution, but what about the selfishness part of it? Does it just shift the selfishness to the organism instead? Well, if we look at the history of the evolution of complexity of life over billions of years, again, in recent decades, what evolutionary biologists have looked at is there's only been a few major stages in this shift in evolution from single cells to complex cells to multicellular life to animals, mammals, and ultimately with humans. Every one of those great steps in evolution came out as a result not of increased competition, but increases in cooperation, where different entities learned that by working together, by cooperating, they could achieve something far greater than was done before. So life, in fact, evolved through cooperation, or in the words of the great systems biologist Lynn Margulis, life did not take over the world by combat, but by networking. And the key secret that life got to understand, and as a result of every one of those great steps in evolution, is this notion of mutually beneficial symbiosis. And it's that symbiosis that leads to what we can think of as the harmonic dance of life. And we can just, if you just imagine yourself walking in a forest, everywhere around you is symbiosis. Plants photosynthesize and provide nourishment. Insects pollinate the plants. Animals transport their seeds. They fertilize the soil for the plants. Fungus then regenerates all the waste and the dead matter, and it turns it into nutrients back for the plants again. And through those mycorrhizal networks, they even transport nutrients for the forest. The whole thing is this harmonic dance of symbiosis. What systems biologists now recognize is that organisms themselves are not even separate entities, but they're self-organized fractal dynamic patterns. In the words of Carl Woese, one of the great biologists of the 20th century, they're resilient patterns in a turbulent flow. As he says, it's becoming increasingly clear to understand living systems in any deep sense, we must come to see them not materialistically as machines, but as stable, complex, dynamic organization. And it's that organization, that mutual symbiosis that's formed this fractal cascade of abundance that is the glory of the world we are a part of today. So now when we ask, what am I? We can begin to say, oh, I am actually a resilient pattern of self-organized cooperation as part of this unfolding of life. And so let's just turn to this question then, based on all this, how should I live? Well, again, we kind of know what our dominant culture tells us, right? It tells us that humans are intrinsically selfish and greedy, and selfish behavior by individuals is in the best interest of everyone. Like in the words of Gordon Gekko from the movie Wall Street years ago, greed is good. And even those who don't agree that greed is good, and to Richard Dawkins' credit, he's one of those people, but they feel we then have to overcome our selfish genes. As he said, let us try to teach generosity and altruism because we're born selfish. We have to understand what our selfish genes are up to upset their designs. So it's this battle against our own genes. But once more, modern findings in evolutionary biology and human evolution have shown the exact opposite. Humans actually evolved to be cooperative. Early hominids, millions of years ago, were vulnerable to predators in the new changed environment. Those who learned to collaborate were the most successful. And over millions of years, our human identity expanded from self and kin to include the entire group. And it's that human ability to cooperate with each other, even those who are not kin, that differentiates us from other primates. And it's as a result of that that we've developed what psychologists now call moral emotions, that we feel in our gut, a sense of compassion or guilt or shame or gratitude or embarrassment. And we don't just act morally, as Dawkins thinks, because we think we should. We do so because it feels right in our gut. And indigenous cultures around the world understood that and built their societies on that understanding. In Africa, you have this profound concept of Ubuntu, which basically translates as I am because you are. And in North America, where I am, and like you have the Lakota tribe has this great phrase, Nitakuye o Yasin, we are all related. And they're not just talking about their group of humans, but they're talking about all living entities around them are all part of the same family of life. So from that, we get to recognize that our flourishing is based on our intrinsic connectedness within ourselves and with others around us with the natural world and with the entire living earth. And so human flourishing itself, we can recognize, is fractal. That each of us are human mind, body organisms, which are just a fractal part of our communities, which are a fractal part of the living earth, which was probably best summarized by the great humanitarian Albert Schweitzer in the 20th century, who said, "I am life that wills to live in the midst of life that wills to live." And as he said, as a result, I cannot but have reverence for all that is called life. That is the beginning and foundation of morality. And so when we look now at this question, how should I live? We can begin to answer that from this foundation. I should live in reverence and care for all life. So let's now turn to this final question. Why am I? And if we again take the received answer to that question from our modern dominant worldview, well, the answer is there is no answer. We live in a pointless universe. The great Nobel Prize winning physicist Steven Weinberg, who was a real spokesman for reductionism, basically famously said, the more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. But when we begin to look at our universe as this interconnected web that we've been exploring, we get to see that meaning itself is a function of connectedness, that on the complex systems which we are part of, as the number of connections increases, they lead to a phase transition and the emergence of new meaning. And we see this everywhere around us. So in simple contexts, when words connect up, language emerges. When organisms connect, an ecosystem emerges. When neurons connect, consciousness emerges. So some of you may have had in your life some sort of peak experience of oneness, a peak experience of like getting a deep sense throughout your being of being part of something so much bigger, your identity being part of some huge thing. And we're told, oh, well, that's well and good, but of course, that's not scientific, right? In fact, what we can now see is that modern science validates that feeling. When you're feeling that, what you're feeling is the profound wisdom that science itself is explaining to us about how the universe works. And that connectedness has implications, which is that everything you do in your life creates those Lee ripples, which affect everything else in the universe. This principle of the ultimate connectivity of everything in the cosmos. So we exist in an ocean of Lee, and those Lee ripples exist within each of us. So the choices we make, the personal choices and actions, to participate in regenerative community, to engage in the broader political process, all of those choices together are what weave the web of meaning. So now, when we start to look at this profound question, why am I? We can start to think about it in terms of, I am here to weave my part in the web of meaning. And maybe if enough of us can recognize that and act our lives accordingly, maybe we can regenerate our beautiful, fragile earth and regain it for life itself. So just to conclude here, this is the book that a lot of these themes are from. You can reach me at some of these websites, and you can also join with others as part of a network of regenerating that earth through this brand new Deep Transformation Network that just got launched a few weeks ago, where people who care about these issues are connecting around the world. And right now, as we finish my presentation, I'm going to go into breakout groups. And in these breakout groups, I invite you to reflect on and discuss with others in the group, what is the unique thread that life is asking me to weave in the web of meaning? And as you explore that and share that with others, what I'd like you to focus on is not so much what you are doing right now in the world and part of that weave, but what is life calling you to step up to? What's that next step? What's the edge that actually allows you to really weave what's needed for this crisis that life is facing right now? Thank you to all the groups who allowed me to just drop in and be a fly on the wall. It's to feel the collective intelligence that is brewing in this amazing group.
Jeremy, you described how humans evolved consistent with the rest of nature in harmony.
Right.
humans didn't embark into this world in a way that was contrary to all the principles you described, and yet something went wrong to divert humans off the correct course. And we need you to tell us what you think that was so that we can figure out what we do about it.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think that the secret sort of lies in that Taoist insight, that sense of that way, or that sort of prefrontal mediated cognition that is not necessarily unique to humans, but it's uniquely advanced in humans. And I would actually see it not so much as something going wrong, but something going different. There was both right and wrong things about it, but leading to these imbalances. And actually, what I trace in that book I mentioned, The Patterning Instinct, looking all the different ways in which humans made meaning from the universe, from hunter-gatherer times to the present, what you can see is kind of different stages of separation that we each have from ourselves and with the rest of life. And that first separation comes with that mediated consciousness from the prefrontal cortex, that sense of that allowed that way thinking, like language and developing technology and stuff. But we were still very much part of nature then. A big shift happened with the rise of agriculture, and not so much with agriculture, but with sedentism. When people settled down in places, and then they would create fences to create what they were cultivating versus the rest of nature, began to fear nature. And hierarchies also developed in the human experience as a result of some people doing better than others, and wealth became a value in itself. That was a big shift in layers of separation. Another great shift happened with the rise of dualistic thinking with the ancient Greeks. Another major shift, one of the most significant, with the scientific revolution in the 17th century, which is not to say that these are bad developments. So many great benefits arose from the development of technology rising from that. But that notion of nature as a machine, and that sense of nature as a resource to exploit, also led to the inauguration of capitalism, and the sense of seeing all of life as something to exploit and extract rather than to be part of. And that, with the rise in corporate domination, basically we can see corporations as the manifestation of that capitalist mindset, has led to these multiple ratcheting effects of separations leading to this dominant worldview, which is why going back to that sense of connectedness is, to my mind, fundamental to the shift in trajectory that we need.
What does a group want to do in order to get connected with those who make the decisions and get the solutions in the system, and that to a level that things are turned around within the deadlines?
Yeah, I think that is so critically important as we're looking at things unraveling. And I'd be very interested in other perspectives that anybody else in the group has to answer that. My own perspective is that maybe we need to think, sort of go one layer below and look at how decisions themselves are made. So I think, we recognize just accessing those in the current leadership roles in power right now is fraught with difficulty. But the way that we can access power is through devolving power to the people, basically, because people in general don't want this kind of destruction. Generally, people around the world, they come alive at sense of being part of community. They want to be part of nature. What we need to do, in my view, is actually actively devolve power back to the grassroots. And one way of doing that is actually literally getting out on the streets, letting those different ideas be known about. Another way is to form our own community groups to actually make our lives work in the way that we feel that they should, and let essentially the new ways of being become the ones that attract people, that are relevant, so that these old systems that are so destructive ultimately become almost like less and less meaningful and just less part of what brings people alive. But very interested to hear what others have to say, if anybody wants to add a perspective.
As you mesh together all these filaments into a new pattern, I'm aware that soul didn't manifest or reveal itself in your presentation. I'm curious about how you perceive soul fitting into this.
So it's one of those incredibly powerful terms that kind of means different things to different people. I actually, in my book, The Web of Meaning, I talk towards the end about what I call spirit. And I use the word spirit rather than soul, because soul is so much connected with in the monotheistic sense of that separate, in fact, Descartes actually literally took the word soul and said, I'm going to call it mind. And so sort of like it's very much part of that dualistic way, like the soul goes to heaven or whatever it might be. But spirit, that sense of that intangible quality of not just what we are as human beings, but and something that touches with the divinity of what we are as human beings. But as we see that in all kind of living systems around us. And what I explore is how modern systems understanding of looking at those patterns of organization, that you can all essentially define spirit using language of systems. It's about these complex, coherent attractors of patterns of behavior that living self-organized beings create, which I sort of explore in detail in the web, meaning how that is the case. And we can see that as spirit. And that's we can see spirit as something that actually each of us has. There's really like Ali. There's patterns that actually get shared out in the universe. So in a sense, our spirit or our Li is transmitted all through all of our activities. We incorporate the spirits of all those around us in their patterns of behavior in their Li. So I see it sort of more as something where as our identity expands beyond our separate self to become part of all of life, it's like our spirit actually gets to be one of and merge with all of life around us. So anyway, that's just obviously way too profound a concept to try to give it a one soundbite to, but that just gives you a sense of how I think about it. So thank you for raising that question.
I'd like to know how you see music fitting into all of this.
Music is actually profoundly important as a form of human communication, which is, again, something I explore to some degree in the later parts of the Web of Meaning. Because we can see music in a way, it's like we often look at human evolution and think about language as this key moment in which sort of humans shifted somewhere in their sort of cognitive abilities, etc. But music was right there way before language as something, a way in which humans were able to communicate what we can think of as their animate consciousness. A little bit like the Taoists were looking at that separation of like the Wu-Wei consciousness. Music allows us as humans to actually transmit those deeper qualities of our lived experience in a way that language can only come close to doing, maybe through poetry or whatever. And in that sense, it's a profoundly important ways in which we can actually move out of that sense of separate identity and become part of something greater and bigger. And we see that in, it's known as mimetic consciousness. Like you can see that just in terms of rhythm, like you can be part of in a sports stadium and feel that sense of being part of a great group, or in ritual, in religious ritual, you can sense that sense of being out as something greater. But it's also this beautiful way in which we can connect with others and share these complex feelings. And I think is a profoundly important pathway to that deeper connectedness. I don't know if you, Rexley, wanted to add anything more in your own insights regarding that.
Yes, earlier on, I think you had a picture on your presentation. I think, was it heightened awareness or a sort of a raised level of intensity in experience? And arts can produce that the same, or not the same way as nature, but it's as if there's something, as you say, with the fractal connections, music seems to have all those connections already. And it can sort of plug in anywhere. And of course, there's an enormous range of styles, but funnily enough, music in its most sort of primary elements, if you want to call them that, seems to be able to connect people right across different traditions or different and even if they change it slightly, or they, they want to play Imagine on an army of sitars in
Right.
India, we still recognize it. And so it can somehow, it's got this shifting ability, and it can travel so well. And so it is, of course, extremely mysterious, and the way it's connected to mathematics and is
Yes.
also rather mysterious. And I hope it
Yeah.
remains mysterious, actually, in a
Right.
funny way. That's the last thing I'm going to say. Because if we
Exactly.
know, if
Yeah.
we had too much kind of cerebral knowing about it, eventually it might not have that kind of magical power. I don't know. That's just a very superstitious remark.
Well said. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. It makes so much sense to me. Excellent. Yeah.
I want to just explore something with you, which is a question that Christopher asked about the soul.
Yeah.
And so the question you asked us to consider was, what is that unique thread that life is asking us to weave in the creation of meaning?
Yeah.
That's the soul thread.
Mm.
That is the unique piece of that great interconnected weave of spirit. That is the, as Jan Smuts called it, the universe is individuating as the individual universalizes.
Yeah.
There's something profound in that, what appears to be a duality of the soul and the spirit. I'm wondering, Jeremy.
Yeah, beautifully said. I mean, that I think that summarizes exactly that point, that it's this profound concept that I go into in quite some depth through the book, this notion of integration. Integration being this recognition of unity with differentiation. And so it's not like this concept that, oh, there's always oneness, that the true reality of life is that we're all one. Well, the true reality of life is that we're all integrated, and there were all these unique threads. We're all this unique attractors. We all have our unique spirits, but all as part of something so much bigger. So in just the same way that each of the cells in my body is unique, it's doing its thing. Like my skin cell is very different from my neuron, which is very different from my heart cell. They're all totally unique, but they're all part of this bigger entity. And in the same way, we are all part of this bigger entity of life unfolding. And potentially even beyond that, life itself unfolding is part of this even more massive glory of the universe unfolding. And it's within that, once we recognize that, it gives a sense of liberation, and also a sense of responsibility, a sense that our thread matters. This web that we're weaving, the future that's unfolding, is not a spectator sport. It's something that we are actually doing. The future itself is like a verb. We are all futuring interactively by what we're doing together. Way back in the 60s, there was that famous statement that Joseph Campbell said when he talked about follow your joy, just kind of follow what comes alive. And as over the decades since that period, as we see life under this destruction from the civilization that we're all part of, that's been kind of restated, which I think it's kind of scary, but also a very powerful concept. It's follow your heartbreak. When we are realizing that we're part of life, when we do have that sense, something gets to us. For me, sometimes it might be like looking at the elephants getting destroyed and recognizing they might go extinct this century. Other people have something completely different that gives them that sense of heartbreak. And that, I think the thing to do is to take those moments when the enormity of what's going on feels like more than we can handle. And one is to share it with others, because we can't handle it alone by ourselves. But then let that turn into the energy, the direct, that is life speaking with us. And let that tell us what we should be doing. And I think ultimately when something comes alive in you, when something feels like, oh, I want to get up in the morning and do that, because that's going to make me feel that I'm actually doing something for life, that's when you know that life is speaking to you in that regard. And it can be very different for different people.
When it comes to the pressing factor of the precipice, I also was wondering about the question of resilience, because as those who are kind of carriers who are willing to show up to assisting this unprecedented transition that we're undergoing collectively as a mankind, to the next chapter of our evolution, amidst so much uncertainty and confusion, how do we remain centered in our own resilience? Especially as younger generations, because I have studied whether the next generation of leaders can be the carriers of the characteristics of new paradigms and helping us to assist and define or create the conducive conditions where these new worldviews and narratives can emerge. But now we're called a generation, as millennials, we're called pandemials because of the repercussions of this giant transition that we're undergoing. So it's a responsibility how we remain resilient personally in our personal ecosystems, in our personal communities and wider.
Yes, yeah, you're asking great questions. Yeah, and clearly I'm not equipped to give all the right answers to what you're saying, but I do feel that one of the most important things we need to do is recognize that this system of the media-based these weapons of mass distraction that we're all embedded in so powerfully right now, that these are driven by corporations trying to maximize their profits at the expense of our well-being. And to pull ourselves away from that to some degree and to stay connected within ourselves, stay connected with life, stay connected with real community. And it's through those connections that I think resilience can really build, to always stay remembering that we're not about that recent sort of whatever the most recent meme or whatever it is that's drawing our attention, but we're about something deeper, that basically reconnecting with life. And I think it's important to recognize just a couple of things about this web of meaning and this kind of sense of the future unfolding, that none of us are going to make these changes alone. Like, it's not like any of us, it can be almost like overwhelming sometimes to feel a responsibility. But we know that that's not the case. We're not going to make the change by ourselves. But when we are connecting with others around us, and not just connecting, but amplifying those connections. So when each of those connections in that network for change are amplified by what we're doing, what others are doing, the transformation that can take place can be mind-blowing. And that's where the nonlinearity of change that system scientists tell us about can play as to a sense of hopefulness, that no matter how bad things are looking, and I share the sense they're looking very bad, that doesn't mean that we should ever give up hope that the transformation that's possible when enough millions and hundreds of millions of us are connecting around the world for life, sharing that sense of a life-affirming possibility. That's the kind of transformation that can take place, but with us as part of something so much bigger.
Thank you.
So just wanted to touch on one other thing about the question of pantheism. And so I did just want to touch on that and explicitly say, again, that's something I do discuss in the web of meaning. And I do feel that, and myself, I do get drawn to that way of thinking about life. Pantheism, this notion of seeing the divinity in everything around us, seeing the divinity in the universe, not that the divinity is somewhere separate, but it's in all aspects of our lived reality. And once we get to see that, we get to sort of look at life and our approach to life with reverence. Essentially, reverence imbues every way in which we relate to every aspect of life. So to me, I would consider myself basically a pantheist in that regard. If you're interested in being involved in some of these issues towards world transformation, there is this online global network that just launched, I was involved in helping to launch just a couple of weeks ago, called the Deep Transformation Network. And you can actually find it at deeptransformation.network. And so I invite you all to join and sort of bring these conversations into a group of people that we want this to be a forum for people to really build community together. And secondly, if people are interested in going deeper into these themes that I touched on in the presentation. I'll be offering a 10-week course. It's actually called Principles and Practice of Deep Transformation, which has to do with the themes from the patterning instinct, the web of meaning, and the vision of what we haven't touched on today, but of an ecological civilization, a different life-affirming civilization. And if you're interested in being part of that 10-week course, you can find out more about it on the link I just gave. I'm giving it through Gaia Education. So thanks for that. So over to you, Claudius and Joshua.
Brilliant. And then I'm very pleased to announce that you will be offering a short workshop on the 17th of March. That's 4 weeks from now, Thursday, the 17th of March, 90 minutes. And the theme of that will be attuning to the web of meaning, an introduction to the practice of liology.
Yeah, thanks.
And
perhaps I should just add a little bit more explanation of a couple of those things. One is, and thank you for that prompting, Claudius. So a month from now, basically, we're going to be, it's as if today was more of this cognitive, conceptual way of approaching this connectedness. A month from now, we're going to be doing like more of an interactive workshop where we're going to be kind of embodying and getting a deeper sense of what that connectedness actually means for our life's practice. And I call that liology. I have an institute called the Liology Institute. And the word liology, well, you saw in the presentation, you saw that word li, those principles of connectedness. So liology basically is this notion of a study of, an embodied study of those principles of interconnection of all the universe. So that's what I'll be introducing to you in a more interactive practice way a month from now. Thank you, Claudia. Back to you, Claudia.
Thank you so much. And that'll be so beautiful because that fits into our deep quest into the deeper dimension of what holism is about.